Welcome to the stage, Charles Schultz, with the first keynote talk of the conference. Thank you, Charles.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. So my name is Charles Schultz. Very glad to be here this morning. The talk and the subject of that talk was graciously named "Open Source Not Dead." Open source is really not dead. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this. Just before beginning, a few words about Vate, if you don't know us by now. We're a French company based in Grenoble, and what we do is we deliver a full virtualization stack from management and backup all the way to the hypervisor, and we do this in a purely open source way. I've heard a lot about KVM, the last presentation. I'm a little bit disappointed, because as you see, Vate's and Vate's technologies are entirely based on Xen, but it's okay. Anyway, so before we start, a little bit about myself. I've been in open source for, well, most of my career, really. I've been doing a lot of cybersecurity as well, and I've also been involved in the Open Office project, as well as the Document Foundation LibreOffice project, and the ODF, Open Document Format, shenanigans, funny years. Anyway, but today I kind of wanted to give you a sort of an update of where open source in general stands. And I'm going to try to do that because obviously it's kind of a little bit complex, but an overview might actually be helpful. So if you actually roam the corridors of most open source conferences around the world, you're going to hear a lot of kind of sad and very somber talk about, oh, you know, open source, we're at an existential threat level at this point because of this, because of that, and you know, it's not, you know, in the good olden days it used to be better, etc. I think it's just not true. I think we've always been at a level of existential threat, and at the same time we've known since about, well, 25 years, an unprecedented level of growth and adoption, in fact. But at the same time, there will and there are always enemies of open source and people who simply either do not understand open source or, at the end of the day, who believe that open source just simply should not exist because it's just not convenient for their business model. So the very first threat, the very first problem that we're facing these days are literally what we call open source. So open source it's an interesting problem. It's probably one of the trickiest one, really. Because when you come to think of it, open source is born from within most of initially open source companies who had open source as their key component for their business models. They would be selling services, they would be selling support contracts, they'd be selling sometimes open source and, you know, proprietary software at the same time. But at some point, they switched. At some point, they just simply did not say, oh, you know what, we're going to turn this into, we're going to turn our product, we're going to turn our software into a proprietary software. What they did is what they started to say, well, you know, as our software is now massively adopted and used because of cloud computing and public cloud adoption itself, well, we're going to just change our license, if you will, and that license is going to basically stop X, Y, and Z actors, most of the times infrastructure providers or platform as a service providers, to rely and to use our software as is, and basically they will have to pay us a certain lump sum of money. Now, from a business point of view, I understand how this feels and I understand how this goes, but the very consequence of that is that when you actually get to read their open source license, you actually realize that they infringe basically on the basic freedom of open source software and provided and carried and conveyed by open source software. And, well, some of them did submit the license to the OSI. OSI is the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative is, among other things, the custodian of the open source definition, if you will. And they have, as a second mission, I wouldn't say the certification, but they are basically the ones who have the authority to certify and assess whether a software license is open source or not. And in most, if not all cases, those companies submitted the licenses and the licenses got rejected on the basis that, well, yeah, it sounds like open source, but it really isn't open source at all. Now, it is a complex problem because what it basically requires, or what it points out, is that the event of the massive cloudification, if you will, of a lot of things has asked for the need for better or newer licenses, and licenses that would be open source themselves. But at the same time, it might also have been, at the very beginning, a wrong choice or a misadapted choice of software licenses, because there just might have been some other ways to do and to generate more revenues for these companies. So you see, that's one problem, and we've started seeing this about 3-4 years ago, so a bit before COVID, and it's just been going on, and it seems to be rising, but it's going to be quite interesting to see whether those companies ultimately will manage to actually generate revenues and be sustainable in the long run with their newfound licenses and business models. Now, the other threat, it's actually quite a funny one, but it's a very dangerous one in a sense for me. You have a number of companies who have nothing to do with open source software. Some are in telecoms, massive telecom players. Some are in automotive. Some are in other industrial sectors. And they very much have decided that open source is all nice, fine, and dandy, but we're just not going to stick to any of the content of what open source really means. And so they are actually working their way through specific international standardization bodies to essentially give another definition to open source. Another definition, which the one that is commonly accepted, another definition that the one that is coined by the Open Source Initiative, even another one that the FSF itself gives. So it's kind of problematic because on the face of it, it's quite funny. What this amounts to is to basically call anything open and anything open source. So, you got like, you got a great airline. It sells, it does everything in its service in an open source way. It means nothing to anyone. But it's okay. We can just coin it like that. Because you see, open source is actually not a certified set of norms. I mean, it is a set of norms, if you will, that is somewhat flexible, but that is first and foremost encoded into specific legal principles. Now, it is a lot more than that, as we know. But if you need to start somewhere, you got to start with some basic legal licensing characteristics, if you will. And now, these guys are trying to do something else with it. And again, it's kind of funny on the face of it, but when you come to think of it, this could actually prove to become quite harmful to open source in general and to ourselves, to our ecosystem, because there's going to add massive amount of confusion. And essentially, it just might tame the definition of open source and its model to an irrecoverable stage. So we'll see how that goes. There's a series of standardization moves that are happening at this place. They might fail. Some of them might work. So, we'll give you, we'll see what it gives in 1 year or 2 years from now. So this is a very, 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 very old one. You can't make money with open source. Well, yes, you can. And I think I'm talking to a lot of people who know how to make money with open source here. But you would not believe how strong this prejudice is across the industry and across anybody else who has vaguely heard about open source and who works in other parts of the industry. But there are parts of, let's say, there are various sectors, industrial sectors, where it is stronger than others. If you talk to people in the telecom industry, for instance, they actually think it's impossible to make money on open source. Now, something has to be said about this. It's not so much a threat as it is something which is a almost perennial wrong notion about what we're trying to do. But we need to acknowledge that as there are a lot of different definitions, in fact, and different ways to do open source, there's also different business models about open source. It's not just one or two. There's different ways to go about it. And in doing so, we need to acknowledge that basically, yes, it's, the certain type of business models are not going to be open source, but certain others are going to be, and certain other models haven't been invented yet. Now, this one is kind of an actual one, mostly concerns and affects companies and peoples living in the European Union. It is the CRA, Cyber Resilience Act. I have to say, I'm a bit biased because I've seen the CRA myself several years ago when it wasn't called a CRA and it was just a French text. And basically, what this is about is the European Commission attempt to think that they're going to pull a big GDPR move on cybersecurity and that they're going to be just genius people. It actually comes from a good intention, I believe. The CRA mandates all sorts of companies, so from software vendors to open source projects themselves to manufacturers of anything that has some kind of software in it. So this means it goes from Vates to Siemens to Dento Pro, the manufacturer of electric toothbrushes. That's what it means. That's how far and wide this can reach, okay? And depending on the type of software or devices that you're manufacturing or you're developing, you're providing, you're selling, well, you have different types of cybersecurity related requirements. And I got bad news for a lot of people here. We fit in the critical ones. Got a hypervisor? We fit in the critical ones. Got an electric toothbrush? It's not critical, but you can do self-assessment, but okay. So the thing here is what this entails. If you were to read, the CRA itself is not published yet. It still is in a draft mode, if you will. But what this fundamentally means is you're going to have all sorts of new obligation. You need to basically document everything about your stable release and then document your security process, then share your security process with the ENISA and with your National Cybersecurity Authority, then explain essentially what's going to be your process in case if there's a vulnerability that's been discovered, and then share the vulnerability itself or whatever indicators of compromisions you have seen and witnessed with those authorities. And essentially, it adds quite, let's say, cumbersome amount of work for each release. And there's a lot of areas that are unclear. For instance, I'm going to take an example that is in my company, but I'm sure this applies to many of you here. So let's take XCP-NG. XCP-NG is a hypervisor. It's a server-type hypervisor, class 1. It's basically an open source, actively developed, Xen-based general-purpose hypervisor. So you're going to have the Xen core itself, and then you're going to have, if you will, the entire plumbing on it. And now we even have a web-type interface on top of it, okay? Now, what that means, as you have understood, is that you got Xen, and then you got a whole different types of components and libraries. Where do we stop on our security watch? Is it enough to explain to the ENISA, to the European Union, that the Xen project itself has a great security process and a great security team? Or do we need to go much further? And how much further do we need to go? This, for instance, is not clear. So the problem with the CRA with respect to open source is that it literally handles open source projects as, I don't know, a car manufacturer, probably German. And, it just doesn't make any sense. So it means that if you're, John Doe, and you have decided to write an open source email client for the sake of it, well, does it mean that you need to talk to the ENISA just before your first release? I mean, it makes no sense. And so there's a lot of gray areas here because I think the European Commission, after millions and dozens and dozens and dozens of millions of euros of consulting fees, presentations, PowerPoint, lawsuits, years, salaries, whatever, still does not get what open source is, still does not get what open source means. There's a lot of other things they don't get, unfortunately. But, that's what it is. So ultimately, you might think this paints a very grim, or rather grim, let's say, portrait, if you will, of open source and this state of open source. But as somebody very wise and much wiser than me once said, our enemies are the ones who define us. So if you think about all the dangers, all the problems I've told you about, you might think, and you should think, that this helps define who you are and what you're doing. And you might take comfort in this. Because ultimately, I don't think this is going to be a terminal attack on open source. Because if you will, open source now is just becoming, if you will, more than something which has a large momentum. GitHub being one example. There's not just GitHub, as you know. There's a ton of other projects who are not on GitHub. Ton of code, tons of open source code that are not on GitHub. But at the end of the day, when you go and when you're trying to sell, your products or your services to companies, what you discover is that at the very end of the day, open source is the default. Open source is the default. There's only very few reasons why you may want to keep something behind, maybe not corporate firewall entirely, but at least something completely proprietary. So open source now has become the way. It is normal. It is something that developers work on. And everything else is the exception. And that is the state of things today. And I don't think we're going to change for a very, very long time. There's always going to be proprietary software, but it's going to be gradually, it's just going to go gradually on the margins. 10 years ago, to give you an example, in the field of cybersecurity, if you were to talk to any executive, any responsible, any manager or director of national cybersecurity authorities anywhere, they would tell you, no, but you need to keep everything proprietary. But what those people would completely ignore is that their very engineers, their developers, had already put and published their code on the internet. I mean, you can go and look. You have French National Cybersecurity has tools on GitHub, on GitLab. You got NSA, it's doing the same. I think GCHQ is doing the same. BSI, German BSI is doing the same. Everybody does. But you had this notion 10 years ago that, it's better to keep software proprietary because then, we keep it secret. We keep the code secret and nobody can find about it. Doesn't work that way. Proprietary software just means obscurity for honest people. The bad actors will find their way in and they won't tell you about it. That's what it means. That's what proprietary software means. So I'm beating up a little bit about the proprietary software people. They're good people, don't worry. But my point is, open source now is the default. And in that sense, open source has already won. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Monty. Thank you, Charles. Any questions for Charles from the room? Guido.
So thanks for your talk. Talking about the Cyber Resilience Act, I think there is a part in there which is called a software bill of materials, which you need to provide. And in my opinion, that is something which we are lacking. I'll go back to the Log4j situation where many people were asking the question, are we using Log4j? Are we affected? You see that many companies and products are actually struggling with finding out if they're using different components. So I think that part from the Cyber Resilience Act, as you said, it probably came from good intentions, that we should have better tooling to making software bill of materials for every release we make.
I totally agree with you. And on top of that, I'd say this. The notion of software bills of materials have been floated around, in the open source circles, since about at least 2017 to 2016. If you remember something which it's still called SPDX, we have this embryo of software bill of materials. It's not a SBOM, it's not a bill of materials really, but it started with this mapping of every component into a piece of software and their coding license and their licensing dependencies, if you will. So, yes, this would be good. And in fact, there are a number now of tools, open source tools, that handle the generation and track and scanning of software components, and then generate the software bills of materials. So there's even companies, I think, now who basically, they have tools that audit your code. They either audit them for component mapping, security, vulnerability, but also for obsolete software versions, libraries versions. And then they also help you with, I would support that. But honestly, I don't think we need a European-wide bill just to enforce software bills and materials. This is something, and I'm not trying to say that the industry is self-regulating. That's not at all what I'm saying. I don't believe that it's the case, but it is a general move that I've observed since quite a few years, I'd say.
Thank you, Charles. Any more questions for Charles? Okay, thank you, Charles.